thank you everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to give this talk, albeit from my spare room rather than in person. So today I'm talking about safeguarding the nation's digital memory, and if you see me looking over to the right, it's because I've got a second screen there which is rather larger and I can read it. So this is a really exciting project which has only just finished. The last tweaks to the resulting tool were done in February, and the National Archive has now adopted it to take forward in perpetuity. So this is how the talk is arranged, more or less. We're going to talk a little bit about archives. What are they? What is their function in society? And then we're going to take a slight detour into the technical side of things. If you're not following that, don't worry. I am trying to condense a 30-page research paper into 6 slides. But it's just to give you a general feel of the kind of techniques that we're using under the hood, as it were. Then the heart of the talk is the National Archives project, of course. How we did the model building and where we got data from, structured expert judgment and so on, and the outputs for the tool. And then I'm going to finish up with a few lessons that we learned, lessons from lockdown, and also that we were nominated for the Digital Preservation Awards. So what are archives? Simply, they are collections of primary sources. So letters, reports, minutes, and so on. Is my screen being obscured by your faces? Do I need to reduce that? No, okay.
No, that looks fine.
So all sorts of different kinds of materials, and of course archives have been preserving these for decades, centuries even, and have really good ideas about how to preserve photographs, how to preserve paper, how to preserve artifacts and the like. Digital, on the other hand, is relatively new. So library books are arranged by author, but archives are arranged according to the person or organisation who created it. So materials are often unique, specialised, they're often rare, very few exist, or they are the only one perhaps. They can include the digital equivalents of all the things that we had on the last slide, of course, and there's a growing percentage that are born digital, so they're actually created in a digital format, or they're preserved in a digital format because that's more space efficient perhaps. And so all sorts of people use archives, the people who are just researching their family history, but also government departments and researchers and so on. Very important part of our nation's life. So they can collect different things depending on what kind of an archive they are. So government archives will typically collect things to do with the government itself, things to do with how the government is working and the legislation and so on. Corporate archives, the history of the company. So places like Cadbury's and Ford will have archives which will give a fascinating insight into how their decisions were made and so on. Colleges and universities often have archives, sometimes related to the actual institution itself and sometimes related to other specialisms. Historical societies, they've got a particular event or person in mind. Religious archives have got a particular faith or denomination or place of worship in mind. And special collections are sort of very rare books and things like that in the library. So the National Archive is the official archive of the UK government, and they preserve the key records from around 250 government departments. And these can include things like multiple email threads about a safety issue, and that on this email there will be embedded data, there'll be attachments and all that kind of thing. Also things like AI or algorithms deciding on who has to remain who's allowed to remain in the country. So it's very important that in the future, when they, when these are challenged, that the actual original artificial intelligence algorithm is up for inspection. So huge numbers of terabytes of data, all wide varieties of types of data, and there are some records which have to be held by law forever. A lot of the records are socially important, so like the recordings of the London Olympics, and some of them are also legally important, which is the materials relating, for example, to the Hillsborough disaster, which is still going through the courts. So quite obviously, the act of preserving digital records is called digital preservation. And there's a wide variety of risks to digital things. So digital preservation is a relatively new concern. Many archivists are still working with analog materials and physical objects. They haven't really been sure what data to collect, where the risks were, how they might manage their risks. And if things do go wrong, there can be sort of a lot of social reasons why you wouldn't share that information, which means it's not available to collect and it's not available, therefore, to make decisions on. So you might want to not admit as one department to another department within your organization, or you might not want to admit as one archive to another that something has gone wrong. So this gives a challenge when trying to make decisions about digital risk, about what is the risk and where are the risks and how are they related. So the risks are very often to do with obsolescence and limited lifespan. So this is a nice quote. Archivists like to say that digital records last forever or 5 years, whichever comes first. So we need to be able to preserve the original bit stream and be able to render it sufficiently for the use for which it is required. So there's a lot of interesting talks about what is the original in digital archiving. Is it the bit stream? Is it the document or whatever it was as originally visualized? So the challenges are software. Software goes out of date. It's no longer available. Sometimes it's very bespoke software that's to do a particular job in a particular government department or whatever. They do a very good job with emulators to be able to recreate, run this software to revisualize the documents. Another challenge, of course, is that the people who used to understand the output for this perhaps have passed on, and trying to capture that knowledge is also a challenge. So Google has already announced that it's reducing the amount of volume of stuff that we can store with it. So we have to start thinking, if we've got large volumes of stuff, where we're going to put that, downloading it and storing it safely. Facebook may not be around forever. MySpace wasn't. Then we might lose access to things. If we store things on the cloud, we may lose access because a government decides to close it down, or it goes out of business or whatever. A lot of my coursework is on floppy disk. If I could find the floppy disks, I have no floppy disk driver to read them on, and by now they may not be completely preserved. 8 tracks, VHS, Betafacts, getting your phone stolen. There's lots and lots of ways to lose digital data. And then there are failures, of course, like your old laptop, which has got your old photographs on, suddenly won't boot anymore, and there's nothing you can do apart from to completely reformat the disk and lose everything. I've had a flash drive fail when I've had the only copy of something on there, and that was foolish in retrospect. Hard drives don't last forever either, SD cards and so on. And then if you're copying something from one to another, you can get copying errors, and you've got to check for that. And if you've got huge volumes like the National Archive have, you have to rely on checksums. You can't actually open every file to check that it's there. I was copying my stuff from my desktop onto a hard drive so that it was portable. And it wasn't until I got where I was going that I found out that some of the deeper folders, the folders within folders within folders, actually hadn't got any contents anymore. So that was rather inconvenient. I mean, thankfully, I had the original back on the desktop. It just wasn't where I was. And things like photographs on Facebook, they get compressed, so you don't have the original quality. And even Google, if you have to pay if you want the original quality preserved. And then there's natural disasters. I was reading about a poor photographer who lost a life's work. So they had physical photographs and negatives, but they also had digital, and they'd back them up on all the things and everything. But they had a fire in their office, and everything was in the office. So just like physical artifacts, digital is also vulnerable to natural disasters. So some of the challenges, archives are generally not particularly well funded. They often have project funding, which doesn't bode well for getting somebody with good digital skills, who's probably quite expensive, to come and to stay. And it's hard to communicate to stakeholders what are the benefits of investing in this or that or the other. I mean, we all know that preserving history is important, but do I give 100,000 or 200,000 or 500,000 to this particular project? How much difference is it going to make? And then with constrained resources, we all suffer with this, don't we? Constrained resources, it can be hard to prioritize and to make progress. So next I'm going to switch to the integrating decision support system idea, where it came from, and a little bit of the technical detail that underpins, and then I'll switch back to the archives and tell you about the specific project that we did with the National Archive. So the motivation for an integrating decision support system was actually the Chernobyl accident. So after that, there was a lot of interest in developing decision support systems that would support decision makers making very rapid and very important decisions in the case of nuclear disaster. As I'm sure you're aware, a plume went up and it travelled through the atmosphere, carried by the wind and the prevailing currents, air currents, and it landed on parts of the ground, and the decision had to be made: do we evacuate? Do we tell people to shelter in place? Do we issue iodine tablets? What is the nuclear fallout going to do to the animals, the crops, the grasslands, and so on and so forth? And one of my, some of my colleagues were involved in developing RODOS, which is a decision support system, which wanted to try to bring together information from the medics who were telling people about, you know, lifetime cancers as a result of this decision, the meteorological experts who were saying where the plume was going to land, how much of it was going to come down in the rain, agronomists who were saying, well, actually this type of plant or that type of plant takes up nuclear waste, nuclear material from the soil in these kinds of quantities, and then back to the medics. Well, if you were ingesting that, that's going to increase your lifetime count, and so on. So all these things you can see from the illustration. We have a set of utilities or measures of a success, which are to do with return to normal living and the cost of that. And then there are these 4 attributes in the middle box. You can see the different contributions they make to the overall score. And then on the bottom, what you can see is candidate policies ranked according to the utilities score that they have. And they also had a natural language output. So given that the black and the grey on the far left with the highest ranking, there's a natural language comparison of these two that tells you why one is preferred to the other. So sometimes there are things that you can't put into a model, like political acceptability. And what you really need is to be able to have that narrative so that you can say, well, actually, this gets a slightly lower score, but it's going to be much, much more palatable to the local populace. So we'll go with that because actually it's going to cost a bit more, but the overall cancers are not going to be quite, you know, are not going to be substantially bigger. For example, that's one of the kind of exercises you might go through. And this was also able to plot on a map where the plume was likely to go, and those are different colours are showing different levels of contamination. You can see the point source, which is red, and then you can see the yellow, which is as fairly high, and then they're going to blue, which is very low. And then on this picture, you can see in red places where shelters might be put, which are well out of harm's way, shall we say. So the key question is, can you generalize this? You've got this idea of taking lots of different inputs from different expert panels about different parts of the system. Can you generalize this to other systems apart from nuclear waste, nuclear accidents rather? So this gave rise to the general problem, and so we generalized this. So the idea is that it's got to be formal and defensible, statistical methodology, and the users of decision centers. You think of COBRA or SPIAM or whatever. They're sitting around, they're making a decision together, and we're assuming that they're motivated to do the best thing. So we're not going to just have a situation where if I say pink, then they say blue, and if I say red, and then they say white. So there's not this combative idea, but actually they are motivated to reach a common goal. They have a measure of success in mind, a utility, and they agreed on that, and the structure of it as well, in terms of, so it's usually a multi-attribute utility, but the different attributes might be weighted differently. So health might be more important than cost, or cost might be more important than health, whichever way around. The decision makers themselves have their values inputted into that. And they also have some kind of agreement about basically how the system works. So what influences what, how the flow of information is, and how the flow of influence goes. They also have an idea of who are the experts who will feed into their decision making. So if you want something to do with weather, you'd be foolish to get Jane blogs from down the road when you could have the Met Office, for example. And we would all agree, I hope, that if we were going to get weather and climate information, we would go to the Met Office and their big models and their huge data sets, and we would rely on them. So the Met Office would be one of our panels, but we wouldn't go to them for medical advice. We'd go to somewhere else for medical advice, and so on and so forth. So we have this consensus in our decision making. And so most of these panels will have their own bespoke models, which are rather large. And why don't we just build one big model when it would be infeasibly large? Very often it would take longer to run than the decision horizon, and so on. And as soon as something changed, you'd have to run it all over again, and so on. So that's a link to the paper. It's got all the gory details in. I'm going to sketch them through at the moment. So some of the things that are required for this to work is a consensus on the utility. We've already just discussed that. The utility, what the functions are going to be embedded in that, and the policies, what sort of policies are feasible and possible and acceptable, and the structural consensus. So this is the idea that we have a shared understanding of how the system works, and so our conceptions of causality are the same. So having got those are the common knowledge class. Together, we have all these different panels, M panels, and each of them delivers summaries to the integrating decision support system, which are typically some moments of various functions. So we don't need the whole gory detail. We just need, under each different decision, the values for your part of the system would be. And most of the panelists will use parametric models, so we need some information about the parameters. In order to separate the panels, we need this condition that the parameters are variationally independent. So the parameter space can be written as a product. So each panel has two sorts of quantities available to it: sample summaries about the future movement under various decisions, and beliefs about the parameters, and they donate those to the decision support system. So as an individual, I have expertise in one area, but I don't have expertise in weather. So the idea of the parametric union is that the sample families for the weather I will delegate to whatever the Met Office tells me they should be, and conditional on what the weather is, then I provide my summaries. So I defer both the parameters and the quantities to the most appropriate panel. And so we have a definition called an adequate integrating decision support system. And this is simply that you can unambiguously calculate your utility. It'd be pretty useless if you couldn't do that, wouldn't it? And there's also by adopting the structural consensus, a decision maker could admit coherently the assessments as their own. So this idea of coherence is that personal probabilities behave like formal probabilities. So we need the IDSS to be distributive, so that each panel can have ownership of its own information. And also we can handle uncertainty. What we don't want is giving a high score to something which is very good on average, but has huge uncertainty in it, compared to something which is not quite so good on average, but is actually quite certain. So all the information that I have in my panel is either common knowledge or it's special to me, and it's not useful for anyone else. That's what these two things, the delegable and the separately informed, are basically saying. So if there's a piece of information, it isn't available to half a dozen of the panels, but not all of them. It's either available to everyone or they don't need it, and it's available just to the panel that does require it. And so this is saying the same thing from the other point of view. So I don't believe that you in your panel have information that would give me valuable insights into the values that my panel would take, my area of domain would take under these different decisions. So this brings us to our theorem, which is the central part of the discussion. So we know under what conditions we have a sound IDSS, which has all the properties that we require of it in order to make sound and defensible inferences. So there are various statistical and mathematical frameworks that can be used to form an IDSS. So stage trees are very popular, Bayesian networks as well, chain event graphs and decomposable graphs and multi-regression dynamic models. So looking at the diagram on the bottom, which I've borrowed from some colleagues, so the idea behind the integrating decision support system is that it should be defensible, both in the statistical sense, but also in the practical sense. So we use our integrating decision support system. It comes up with a ranking for our policies. We pick the policy which we think is the highest or nearly the highest, given some other information that isn't possible to put into a mathematical model, perhaps. If everybody's happy, away we go. But suppose somebody's not happy and says, well, actually, I'm not sure why policy 7 should be better than policy 4. And so then that you can then unfold the utility and say, well, these are the measures that came out for each of the elements of the utility. We've weighted them in this way. And if that needs to be adjusted, it can be adjusted. If people are happy, then people are happy. But perhaps they're still not happy. So well, I don't know why it should take that quantity, really. I just don't get it. But then we've got the panels, and we can go back to each panel that's relevant and say, can we just query this? Can we say, can you tell us why under this decision, this value is so high or so low? And because they all have the ownership of their own information, they can then discuss and disclose that. So in terms of government, it's really important that they are able to defend the policies that they made. So obviously a good free press will hold governments to account, but there might also be legal proceedings and other things. It may be a local government that's being held by scrutiny to the central government. There might be all sorts of reasons why defensibility is a really desirable property. So for the National Archive model, we used a Bayesian network, and just to remind you, if you've forgotten what a Bayesian network is, it is a directed acyclic graph and a set of independent statements. So that's what that symbol is, with the two parallel lines, independent statements. And directed acyclic graph, you can see there are 3 nodes in our graph, and they're connected by arrows, which means that it's directed, so there's a direction. And it's acyclic because you can't start at any one of those nodes and get back to it by following the arrows. It's a simple way of factorizing a joint probability. And we can obviously use Bayes' theorem to get the conditionals into a total probability. And if we don't, if the conditionals make no difference, we know we have a set of independent components. So where there wouldn't actually be a cycle or a feedback loop in a system, what we can do with Bayesian networks is analogous to separation of timescales and dynamical systems in which we can stretch them out. So looking at this one, perhaps whether or not it rained yesterday affects whether or not the sprinkler comes on today. So you can see that we've got 2 identical copies of the same DAG. The layout's a little different, but the arrows and the nodes are in exactly the same places. And we have this red arrow, this temporal arrow, from rain yesterday to sprinkler today. And then that way we've preserved the DAG structure, all the mathematics which is going on underneath it can still be used, and we can still use it in that way. So on to the National Archive project. So this went through various stages. We did the soft elicitation and then the model building, and then we started quantifying the model with data. Then we found data gaps, and we went into structured expert judgment. Then we evaluated and got feedback. We hired some software engineers, and that turned out to be a very good idea. And then it was launched and adopted. So soft elicitation, any problem that's got stakeholders and real world situations starts with the problem owners. What is their goal? What are their values? What are their conceptions about how the system works, how it fits together? What are their causal beliefs? So first of all, we have to tease out what is the problem. And this is typically a very iterative process, because they have a very clear and often very linear view of what their problem is and how this is going to go. But actually, when you dig into it, well, actually, there are subtleties here and subtleties there and subtleties there, or maybe there are different perspectives. So the people who first come up with the problem and want it solved haven't quite appreciated that this department over here or this department over here have a slightly different vision of this, and what seems simple on the surface is actually a lot more nuanced underneath. So all these sort of things you have to tease out when you're working with real problems and real problem owners. So what relevant data and expertise is a key one, and available might mean available to us as well as actually existing. And then who's going to use this? How do they need to see the data or the outputs, or how do they go about making decisions? What is relevant for them? If you work with local authorities, they just love traffic lights, red, orange, green. If you can just show me in red, orange, green, I'll be happy. You know, other domains have other conventions. And the levels of mathematical ability or training for the end user might not be the same as the people at the technical end who are building the tool. So it's very much a language learning. It's very much a sort of help me to understand where you're coming from kind of situation, and very iterative. It's a list here, but it is definitely non-linear. So the National Archive said digital preservation is a mission to send messages to the future. So that's what preservation is. And they need to be faithfully transmitted, and they need to be meaningful and useful to generations to come. But the world is not static. The threats are constantly changing. The archive's resources are changing. We talked earlier about it being typically project funding. So that's very unstable. And the ability to deal with things, it's not always easy. Archives have a long list of things they want to do, but they can't do them all. How do they prioritize without the kind of information on which to build this decision? And even the best resourced archives, and the National Archive is pretty well resourced compared to most archives, they still have to make choices about when. What's the priority here? We've only got this person for 12 months. We can either do this project or we can do that project. We can't do both. So what they needed was a framework to manage digital preservation risk. So they needed to understand and to capture the complex interdependency of risk events, how they affect different parts of the system as a whole, and what management actions can be taken to ameliorate, to minimize those risks. It needs to be able to allow very different kinds of threats to be compared. So, for example, the threat from a power failure compared to the threat for flooding. And knowing that they had limited data, they needed something that could cope with that as well. So we did settle on a Bayesian network framework for this. That seemed to be the most obvious modeling choice, and they were very much on board with that. A couple of them, fortunately, were mathematicians, at least had got a maths degree, and so that although they're working in archives now, they had an appreciation of Bayesian networks, and we got in touch via the Turing, actually. So that was very, very strategic. So they had a review internally in 2017 of their approaches to risk management, which tended to be quite qualitative. You know, we found that this helps. And they'd had a mapping exercise to identify the risks. So the digital preservation was just coming up on their consciousness and becoming something that they like, we need to do this now. And then we had a little workshop with them, with TNA and ASNRU, the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit. The contact was made by my colleague Jim. We were brought in then to talk a bit more about Bayesian networks, what they could and couldn't do, perhaps to introduce them to some of the people who were less familiar, and also talk to them about structured expert judgment, which might be required if there was not enough data. So then in November, they were able to bring in some partners, some other archives to give other perspectives, and that was quite an eye-opener, because They had very different processes, very different objects that they were preserving. There were different lengths of journey down the digitisation and digital preservation pathways. And so that was really good to shake things up. So some of the initial thoughts we'd had were then iterated away. And then we did get funding, both the National Archive got funding to hire Hannah, and we got funding from the Impact Acceleration account to hire TACE. And they did a lot of the donkey work here to get the draft network out, and just went through the real tiny detail of discussions. And then when they weren't sure about something, Hannah would go back to her colleagues at the National Archive and just tease out that level of detail. And then the project formally kicked off in January 2020. So we've got by this point an initial Bayesian network idea, and again that was iterated around with the archives, the partner archives, as well as national and a wider body, I think, from National Archive. So this was the network, which was the end network. It was probably the 100th network, but anyway, this is the final network. Lots and lots of technical words on there that I won't presume to explain. This would be an hour's talk on its own. But notice that renderability and intellectual control are the two things that make up the utility. So it's multi-attributes, it's just two attributes. So intellectual control, is this the original? Do we have enough metadata and other processes in place to be confident that this is what was actually stored with us, whether that was last week or last year or 10 decades ago? And renderability is the ability to produce it in usable form. So if I've got my PhD thesis, it's no good to me as a bitstream. I need it in words. So can I render it? This presentation was rendered from LaTeX into a PDF. So finding relevant data. So we do need all the nodes to be measurable. They have to be defined. We need to know whether something is on or off, yes or no, high, medium or low, whatever. All these have to be defined. And that was a lot of work for Tace and Hannah, but they got through it. Where are we going to find? There are surveys. Some of the data was relevant for that. There was previous research. There's a whole research sector in digital archiving. There were available statistics from the National Archive. They had been collecting some data, but typically the data was at the wrong level, the wrong kind of granularity. So, for example, you know, the longevity of this particular type of hard drive compared to this particular kind of hard drive isn't so useful. You want to know what mix of media you've got your archives on, and you know how that influences the overall preservation and so on. So once we'd identified some data gaps, we went for structured expert judgment. Now, structured expert judgment is another whole hour on its own. It's really fascinating. We use the IDEA protocol, which is our favorite protocol to be used. So it's a bit like Cook's, if you've ever used that, but it has an extra round, which makes it more accurate. So it stands for investigate, discuss, estimate, and aggregate. So what we get the experts to do for the questions that we don't know the answer to is to just give an estimate on their own. We give them an opportunity to write down why they think that. And then we have a facilitated discussion. And then we ask them to give a second private estimate. And a lot of the reasons we do this is because there are all sorts of reasons why we might be influenced in the estimates that we give. So there's obviously things called like groupthink. Nobody wants to be the only voice disagreeing. There are power plays. So there are some people who are very loud and bombastic, and it's very hard to disagree with them because they just insult you, or they might be people who are important to you in terms of your career. Very often we find that the PhD students whose thesis is quite close to the questions of interest are the actual expert, and maybe their supervisor isn't so much, but their supervisor might be super confident in their own beliefs. And it's very hard in that kind of asymmetric power situation for the PhD student to stand up in public and say, I think you're wrong, actually. Having got these estimates, we then aggregate or average the results together. There are also calibration questions. So calibration questions are questions which are as close as possible to the sorts of questions that the questions of interest are, but we do know the answer to those. But they're posed in the same way, and the idea is that the assumption that future performance is related to past performance. So past performance is an indication of future performance. So the idea is there that what we can do is we can, after the first round of questions, we have this. So you can see each person, we've got 19 experts on this plot. They're all anonymized, and they've all given their lowest plausible, highest plausible, and best estimate in that order. The reason we ask for it in that order is that we have a problem called anchoring. Most of us would give a best estimate and then plus or minus the same amount. But as you can see on this plot, that a lot of the experts' beliefs were not symmetric around the center. We can see on the left, there's a pink one, which is very different from everyone else. You can see that the uncertainty bands are very, very narrow. This expert is very, very confident that they've got the right value. You can see others which are just very, very wide. And notice that we've given the questions in terms of natural frequencies, because that's much, much easier for ordinary human beings to think about than sort of probabilities which are fractions of a percentage. So what we do is we have this discussion around this. Each expert is anonymized, but they are at liberty to say, oh, that was my estimate and my thinking was X, Y, Z. And then when we go do this again, we find that in practice, where these are the calibration questions, that most people move towards the truth. And so we're assuming that they do that for the questions of interest as well. So this is the method by which we get information, data that we don't have from surveys and experiments, and we use it as real data. We've got this empirical control, we've got some measure of accuracy going along with that. So actually building the tool, it's built in R Shiny. And first of all, we had a couple of Monash computer science students on exchange with me. They were very happy to work on that, and they produced the first draft, and very nice it was too. They had lots of iterations, lots of feedback from individuals at National Archive saying, you know, this isn't very clear. Can we call it this? Can you have a button here? And those kind of things. And then we had 3 online workshops. With archivists worldwide. We had people from Brazil, people from Australia, America, all over, looking at the tool and giving us their feedback. And that was really useful because, well, I didn't understand this, or what does that mean? Or I wouldn't have put that there. All this kind of feedback we got on the presentation of the tool. And then we ended up with a long list of improvement requests, and the National Archive went away and prioritised those. And we employed Jumping Rivers, who were software engineers, and the guy who was particularly working on our project had a PhD in Bayesian statistics, which was very serendipitous. So that was very, very good. And now, because National Archive is a public body, there are accessibility requirements on anything that they put on the web. So these improvements were iterated. So each time it improved, and some people who saw it several times said, oh, this is a lot better. I understand this. You know, the colors, how do we present the utility, and so on. So this is what the front page looks like. It tells you about the tool, and this is the little logo that Hannah came up with, which is very good. And she came up with the name diagram as well, which is a kind of play, obviously, on the fact that the Bayesian network is a diagram, and a useful one, because you don't have to understand the underlying mathematics to get the gist of what's going on here, and therefore have confidence in it. So how does it work? Well, each archive, or the archivist that's using it, goes through a list of, I think it's 12 questions, 11 questions, something like that, which actually tailors the tool to their particular archive. So proportions of their collections which are born digital, the kinds of storage they have, the risk, the flood risk, for example, and there's a link there to looking up your postcode on the Met Office flood risk map, so you can say it's low, medium, high, as defined by the Met Office. So this will then tailor the tool to give to your particular archive. And this is the network that's underpinning it. Obviously, you again get a score for renderability and a score for intellectual control. You can hover over any of these and see the definitions. You have a progress bar, so you know how far through the questions you are. And then you get a score. And what's recently been added is 2 reference scores. So one score is for if you're just uploading everything to the cloud, what would your digital risk be then? And then what if you were something a bit like the National Archive, where you were well-funded, that kind of, a typical kind of well-funded archive. So that gives archivists an idea of where they sit in the spectrum. So, I've got a score of, 17 for this and 15 for that. Is that good, bad, or indifferent? Where do I sit? And that's been very useful as well. And then you can go in and customize it. So you can actually challenge it with, okay, if instead of having, if we spent money on archivist training, for example, we employed an extra person with these kind of skills, you can change the skill levels that you had, and then you can see side by side the difference that it makes in the scores. This is exactly what the National Archive did when they were making their business case for more funding. So these were the partners. So the National Archives were the main protagonists, but also Dorset History Centre, Gloucester Archives, Transport for London Archives, University of Brighton Design Archives, University of Leeds Special Collections, and the utility. And there was a couple of extra ones who came in a bit later as well. And renderability and intellectual control were the main outputs. So we were nominated for the Digital Preservation Awards. I didn't know there was such a thing, but we were finalists. And these are some of the things that they said, which were very flattering. So they see digital archiving innovations from across the world. This is a worldwide competition, as it were. And they were really keen to say that how well it articulated the unique elements of the projects. It's a valuable addition to the tools, that the outcomes are credible. So it shows clear innovation and all the rest of it. So we didn't actually win in the end, we were picked to the post, but it's a very prestigious thing because this is a worldwide competition to even be placed and certainly to be a finalist. Okay. Okay, so this is what the tool looks like, and this is what the TNA spent their spending review on. You can see the contributions of renderability and intellectual control to the different elements. So they had a baseline digital preservation and risk score, and then they showed the current value of risk preservation practices in comparison to a model for simple backup. So this is one of the models that they had as a comparator. And then they saw the risks change over various time periods with and without requested funding. So this gave rise to this 33.5% increase in overall funding. So there were some interesting lessons that we learned from lockdown. So a lot of the money that we would have spent on physical workshops couldn't be spent on physical workshops. So that freed up money to hire Jumping Rivers to do the software engineering and take research software and turning it into something which is something that organizations can use. It's not commercial as such, it's not being sold, but that kind of jump made such a difference, and it was so much better way to spend the money, to be honest, that I should be thinking carefully in future. I think about whether really physical face-to-face is really necessary. Sometimes it is. And similarly, the fact that we were online enabled us to engage not just with the local archives, not even just with a broader range of UK archives, but actually to get feedback in there from Australia and Brazil and so on and so forth, and have them use it and have them evaluate it with us to understand it and feel part of the development as well, because if you have a sense of ownership, you're more likely to use it because you have confidence in it, rather than it being something that's just developed over there and somebody's urging you to use it. So what next? Well, the National Archive has adopted this. They're going to keep it up and running and look after it. We've already discussed about the potential for master's level projects, updating updating the network for different countries, for example. In the UK, the only physical risk we've got is flood risk, but in other countries, fire risk is much more important, or earthquake, or volcanoes, or whatever, and that's not part of the model at all yet. So there's a lot of extension work that could be done, and we have plans to keep going with that. But for now, we're very pleased that a piece of work has got out of the academy and into the world and is doing some good. Thank you.